My name is Zita Holbourne. I'm the National Chair of BARAC UK, Human Rights Climate Race Equality Campaigner, and I'll be chairing this session today. The session has been organised by Global Justice Now, and we've got a really fantastic panel of speakers. And as you would have seen from the publicity, that the session is entitled Who Owes Who? And we're looking at the corporate polluters and how that impacts on the climate movement. And we're going to talk about reparations and what that means in the context of climate, because there are links between the legacies of colonialism, the historic atrocities done to people from the global south, with what's happening today in terms of climate displacement, how people who are displaced, predominantly black and brown people from the global south, are being treated, and who is benefiting and profiting in the meantime. So you're going to hear from some of our speakers who will speak to these particular issues, and are experts in their own fields of this campaigning and work. And I'm going to introduce our speakers at the beginning. We're then going to hear from the speakers. We'll open it up for questions and contributions from the floor, see how we do with time, but hopefully we'll have a good amount of time for discussion amongst us. Then I'll ask the panel to just wrap up with their final comments. So joining me today on the panel, we have Yusuf Blaylock, who is here, and Yusuf is from Friday for Future Balochistan and is a climate justice activist and an organiser for Friday for Future's Balochistan. We have Jean Blaylock, who is here, and Jean is from Global Justice Now. Jean works as a campaign and policy manager and been involved in trade and food campaigning for over 15 years. And we also have, last but not least, Sadie DeCoste from Tipping Point and from Climate Reparations Network. And Sadie is a climate justice organiser with Tipping Point and GND Rising, and is co-founder of the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. So the purpose of this session is to acknowledge the history of colonialism and enslavement and racism, and how that factors into climate injustice and displacement, and look at what is happening in terms of the corporations who are benefiting, whilst those in the global south are suffering and actually are being demonised and blamed for being displaced in the first place. So in the UK, there is a reparations movement. There's been a reparations movement for a number of years, which I've been involved in, which has close links and works alongside activists in the USA and throughout the Caribbean. And often when people think about reparations, they think that we're talking about reparations financially for individuals, for families, but reparations is much more broader than that and goes much more deeper than that. Reparations is about actually having peace. It's about us being able to live now, today, in the West or wherever we're based, in the global South as well, without having to face racism and counter racism every day of our life. It's about ending poverty. It's about us having peace of mind. It's about stopping the impacts on our mental health and the trauma that is generational trauma that passes through generations because of those legacies of colonialism and enslavement, and then the current system, the systemic racism that we're facing today. And actually, climate injustice is part of that systemic racism. You can't separate climate change from racism. It's all part of the same thing. It's interconnected. but very often there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect even when we look at our climate justice movement in the UK and who runs that and who leads that and whose voices are listened to. And very often it isn't the voices of those who are impacted the most by climate injustice. Even for people like myself, whose family is from the Caribbean, we know about climate displacement, we know about climate change because we have seasonal impacts of hurricanes, for example, that are impacting on our families back home, who have to respond to these as an urgent situation periodically, throughout the year. So it's also about, when we think about reparations, it's about the poverty and the debt hanging over the heads of countries in the global south, which that money could be used to develop and support people in the region to have a better standard of life and living, rather than living with that debt hanging over them, whilst you've got these huge corporations who are benefiting financially and living in comfort and luxury off the backs of our misery and the pain and trauma that our ancestors experienced and we are now also experiencing ourselves. And so we're looking at those power structures. Why do they exist? What can we do about them? Who is benefiting from the legacies of colonialism? Because it certainly isn't people in the global south, and it's certainly not black and brown people in the West either. So over to our speakers, and I first invite Yusuf to take the floor and speak. Thank you, Yusuf.
Thank you so much everyone for coming here. My name is Yusuf Baruch and I'm a youth climate justice activist from Balochistan, Pakistan basically. And I'm an organizer with Fridays for Future. Fridays for Future basically is a youth movement and a global youth movement who regularly organizes protests around the world. We organize weekly protests and we organize global climate strike, and we had our global climate strike last Friday on 23rd of September, and I think more than 400 petitions we striked around the world. So basically, talking about the impacts of the climate crisis in my community, I belong to an indigenous community in Balochistan, and I lost my home when I was 6 years old, and we had to evacuate our house in the middle of the night. And this is the story of every household in my community. The impacts of the climate crisis has become a regular norm. Recently, floods in Balochistan, because of the recent floods, more than 304 people lost their lives, and hundreds and thousands of people were displaced and lost their homes, and more than 1,200 people died in Pakistan, and more than 33 million people were displaced due to the floods in Pakistan. And it's just not the numbers of the people; it's more than the entire population of Ireland, Scotland, Sweden. Like if you just together entire population of all those countries, it's more than that. It's just like we need to consider the suffering of those people. It's not something that which we should normalize in our own communities, because most of the times in the West we don't acknowledge the suffering of people in global south. When we talk about the climate justice movements, or when we talk about the climate crisis or climate injustices, we basically mean, as Zita mentioned about, it's the race crisis. It's interconnected with so many other crises in global south. Experiencing all those crises in my own communities, I feel like living at the front line of the climate crisis, I have understand the relation between all those things. In my community in Pakistan, there are lots of exploitation projects going on by the global north countries, and there are lots of companies from Canada, Germany, and so many other global north countries which are exploiting our resources, which are exploiting our lands. And due to that, we are losing our culture, we are losing our languages, because people in those areas have to leave their villages. People in those areas suffering from so many diseases because of those things. Just before the recent floods in Balochistan, there's a place in Balochistan called Piripu. It's just a small town. People were suffering from extreme droughts, and more than 23 people died due to not having water, due to the water scarcity and drinking contaminated water. So it's not just one thing affecting us, it's not the blood, it's not the drought, it's just like the entire system which is built on, like the system of operation which is built by the global north countries, the rich and the elites. And it's the fossil fuels companies which are spreading the agenda of operation in global south because those companies are benefiting from the suffering of our people. Like this year, earlier this year, Shell made more than 11 billion pounds in profits just in 3 months. It's just like it feels like fossil fuel companies are benefiting from the suffering of people. In my community in Balochistan, people are suffering from daily basis on like from the impacts of the climate crisis. So it's so important, especially living in global north. We are privileged. I feel like I'm here. I feel like I'm privileged being here. So it's our responsibility to talk about those issues. It's our responsibility to like put accountable the people in power who have been like making the system of operation and spreading this. So just like I feel like when we talk about all those issues together, it's also important to talk about the loss and damages. There are so many things that we can't adapt, like the lives of the people who have lost their lives, we can't adapt to their lives. But there is still things that we can adapt. So it's the responsibility of global north countries to finance loss and damages in global south and to rehabilitate people who have recently lost their homes due to the floods. So thank you so much
Thank you so much, Yusuf, for that contribution. I'd now like to invite Jean to speak.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, yes. Thank you, Zita and Yusuf, for that sort of the eloquent presentation of the need for reparations and for the North to be paying loss and damage. At Global Justice Now, we're campaigning on those issues, but also on some of the wider economic justice power structures, and that's what I campaign on. And I'm actually here to talk about some of the negative, the other side, because while it may be evident to all of us here in the room that if you ask who owes whom, well, it's the North who owes the South. What's actually happening at the minute, for instance, is that 5 fossil fuel companies are suing governments in secret tribunals for over 18 billion for taking climate action. So not only are they have they been profiting for centuries over this, they are now actually asking for more of a payout. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that power structure and how it's a structure that gets in the way of climate action and of reparations. So the companies are using secret tribunals that are written into trade deals, which sounds very conspiratorial. But I'm going to talk about a couple of the cases and make some of the points about how it works. So just this summer, a UK company called Rockhopper, it's an oil drilling company, it was awarded a massive payout from one of these tribunals when it sued Italy over a ban on offshore oil drilling. Now, this was something that had been fought for quite a long time by many people and campaigners in Italy, and the site that Rockhopper in particular wanted to drill was off an area of the coast that depended a lot on tourism. So, as well as the big picture climate issues, there were also going to be issues on people's livelihoods and so forth. And so there had been massive demonstrations and several years of campaigning before the Italian government introduced this ban on offshore oil drilling. When they did so, then Rockhopper said that they were going to sue in this tribunal because of the government taking that action. So the first point I just want to highlight is the way that these tribunals are often used to reverse the people's victories. People fought for many years, the government finally responded, put a ban in place, and they were sued. The second thing is how much they were being sued for. So there are a couple of estimates of how much Rockhopper had actually invested so far in the place that it wanted to start drilling, but around 35 million pounds. That's not what they're suing for. They're not just suing to recover what they've invested. They're suing on the basis that they want to recover the value of all of the oil that they claim is in that field. If they could get it all out, if the oil price holds up, if nothing went wrong, they reckon that they could make a profit. And that's what they're suing for. And that's what they were awarded. No question, that's what the tribunal gave them. 210 million, 6 times what they'd invested, was what they were awarded by this tribunal. And that's why it's important, because you get massive payouts from these tribunals, far more than, I mean, sometimes there are times when a company might want to challenge the government over something. In the national courts, you don't get these kinds of payouts for anticipated profits in the national courts. And when you combine that with the issue within the need for climate transition, of the fact that many of these companies have on their books what should be stranded assets. They're assets that need to be closed down, they cannot be realised. Companies are realising they can still get a profit from these assets simply by suing for them. So that's the second thing. Another case that is still live at the minute, 2 German energy companies, RWE and Uniper, started suing the Dutch government when the Dutch government introduced a phase out of coal power. Again, same pattern, this was something that there had been many years of campaigning towards in the Netherlands as here, you know, a strong climate movement over many years. They'd actually, the activists had taken the Dutch government to court for not doing enough, and actually the Dutch court did say, yeah, right, if the government is to live up to its obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement, it needs to actually be doing more for future generations. In response to all of this pressure, the government introduces the coal phase out, and it gets sued by 2 of these companies. And the thing that I want to highlight about this is the chilling effect. Now, the companies started being very public about the fact that they're bringing these cases. And these are secret tribunals. There is no actual requirement for anybody to have to say what's happening in the case. They can be completely secret. So when the companies choose instead to shout about it, then what I fear that they are after is that they are seeking to send a very loud message. This government has taken this action and it is being sued for billions, because that's what these 2 companies, they're suing for 1.4 billion and 1 billion each. And that sends a message. It's not just a message to the Dutch government, it's a message around the world, particularly to many countries in the global south who do not have the resources of the Dutch government, and who may see that case and go, oh, so if I took action like that, I might get sued. So maybe I won't take action. So maybe I won't do what's needed. The action that governments need to be taking, that activists have been pushing for, so many people around the world are calling for so long, may be further delayed by these kinds of cases. There are other, so Ascent Resources, another UK company, is a fracking company, is suing Slovenia over a ban on fracking. The owners of the Keystone tar sands oil pipeline are suing the US government after Joe Biden cancelled the the pipelines, one of the things that he did on his first day in office. And I think it's the pattern of the people's victories is something that is writ big here, in that the climate movement is very gradually beginning to push governments into taking action. It's beginning to get a bigger victory. And that's when these companies are turning to this system of tribunals to fight back against that. Which to me is one of the reasons I believe we really just have to challenge that. So what is this system? It's formally called Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS. It gets written into trade deals. Many of these companies are using one particular deal called the Energy Charter Treaty, which kind of sits in the middle of a web of trade deals. It allows companies to sue governments outside of the national legal system. It's a one-way legal system, and you can only use it if you are a transnational corporation, basically. So that's what it is. But often if I say, to people, explain why that's what it is, and people are going, okay, yes, you told me what it is, but actually really what I meant was more like, what, as in, what the fuck? How does it exist? Why does it exist? How did we get this system that seems as though it is ideally designed for the interests of fossil fuel companies, as though they had written it themselves? Well, that's because they wrote it themselves. Back in the 50s, the early 60s, the fossil fuel companies at that point were worried about the former colony countries of the empires in the north becoming independent, saying these really dangerous things like, we now control our own futures, our own destiny, our own resources. And companies going, what? What do you mean you control? No, we own your resources. You can't be saying you control those. And so a German banker called Hermann Abs and the lead lawyer for what was then Royal Dutch Shell, they sat down and they wrote the first draft of this system of tribunals, and they shopped it around governments, and they never quite got what they wanted, which was one big treaty. But they got a network of treaties, and they got, in particular, the Energy Charter Treaty, which has 50 member countries, and which 4 of the companies that I mentioned are using to sue. Now, I know I'm already running out of time, so just to say that at the minute, there are the chance to actually get rid of the Energy Charter Treaty. Because now the rich countries are being sued themselves, they didn't actually expect that to happen. And there are doubts, there are concerns, and there is a move by some countries to actually withdraw from the treaty. So we've been campaigning over the last couple of years, calling for countries all across Europe to withdraw, which, if it happened, would probably lead to the collapse, at least, of the Energy Charter Treaty. So that's something that we are pushing for, because we believe that we need to get rid of this power structure if we're ever going to be able to get both the climate action and, ideally, to actually get the reparation, to make the polluters pay to get the reparations that they ought to be giving, rather than at the minute it's the other way around.
Jean, can you hear me on this mic?
Yeah.
That was really important, I think, to set that out, and we need to expose it more broadly as well. And last but not least, Sadie, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So, when a storm destroys your house, who pays? When a drought ruins your crops, who pays? When your island sinks into the sea, who pays? And where will you make your new home? This is the reality for so many people around the world affected by loss and damage from climate change. From hurricanes in Antigua and Barbuda to drought in Malawi, those who did the least to cause the climate crisis are those who will be forced to pay for it. When we say loss and damage, we're talking about the things that are beyond what we can adapt to, so damage to our homes, to infrastructure, to our crops, and the loss of lives and livelihoods. Indeed, the cost of loss and damage finance in the global south is expected to rise to between 300 and 600 billion US dollars annually by 2030, and that's expected to rise to the trillions of dollars annually by 2050. This finance would be used primarily to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters and slow onset processes like sea level rise. But as Zita rightly said earlier, loss and damage finance is just the beginning, because we don't just want to recover from disasters, we want dignity. And that requires a broader sense of societal transformation, so that reparations brings not just compensation, but a sense of repair of the harms that have been done. And in order to have this sense of repair, we need safe, affordable housing and public transit. We need good public services. We need to return land to the people from whom it has been stolen and respect Indigenous rights. We owe reparations for colonialism and slavery, and that's the responsibility of global North countries and corporations. Equally, repair must take place here and everywhere. We must repair our broken system and respect the dignity of workers, of people of color, of migrants, of the generations that are inheriting the earth. We are campaigning around climate reparations and care and repair with the Climate Reparations Network. We came together to mobilize around COP26 with the big climate reparations block at the March in London. Since then, we've been developing trainings on climate reparations, building a network across social and climate justice struggles, and showing up in solidarity with trade unions and migrant justice organizations. We want to bring the demand for climate reparations into the mainstream political consciousness. We want movements to unite for intersectional climate justice. As has been mentioned, there are movements for reparations that already exist around the world, primarily for the impacts of colonialism and slavery. In the US, the movement for Black Lives is demanding a transformative program of reparations, which includes economic compensation, but also education, cultural revitalization, and access to good jobs, and safe food, housing, and land rights. Similarly, the Caribbean group of nations, CARICOM, is demanding reparations from the European nations, and they've brought that demand to them formally. In the UK, the Make Polluters Pay coalition is calling on the UK government to tax fossil fuel companies and establish a loss and damage finance facility to pay for climate damages in the global south. And the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition is also working on demanding loss and damage finance from governments in the global north from the perspective of global youth. And last week they organized a day of action on loss and damage, which had actions around the world. So in terms of what we're demanding in the lead up to COP27, the central demand within the UN is to establish a finance facility for loss and damage, which would channel pledges from big polluting countries, and it needs to be additional to existing climate finance that they've already pledged, which already isn't sufficient, and those targets are not being met. And it needs to be based on a principle of fair shares, the biggest polluters paying the most. We can expect at COP27 to see resistance from global north countries on loss and damage, as they've done in the past, especially from the US government, but also including the UK government and the EU. There are a few governments who've pledged for loss and damage finance, including Scotland and Denmark, and some others might come forward at COP27, but it's way far from what is really needed. So it's important when we talk about climate impacts happening around the world that we highlight the big polluters that cause them and how they have failed to take responsibility or take any meaningful action toward climate reparations. We need a groundswell of organizing if we're going to succeed in achieving climate reparations. Already, the demands of Global South countries and communities, alongside a big push from civil society, have put loss and damage on the map in a way that it really wasn't there 5 years ago. But we need more. We need big polluters and governments to really feel the pressure. And we need the general public to care about climate reparations. And to do so, we're asking for movements for intersectional justice to consider adopting climate reparations as a core demand. And the Climate Reparations Network is organizing around COP27. We invite you to join our march in London on November 12th as part of the big COP27 Solidarity Day of Action. That's all I'll say, but thank you so much, and let's build a world where we can have care and repair and dignity for all.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Thanks to all of our speakers. I'm going to open it up for questions and contributions. There's a couple of things that I want to mention first. As all of our speakers have alluded to, the reason why we are here is because they were there, and we shouldn't forget that. You know, our lands and our ancestors' lands were pillaged and stripped of resources, occupied, and then when we show up, our families show up here in the UK, fleeing very often the combined impacts of climate change, persecution, poverty and conflict, which have very much been caused by the West. We're told that we're coming to strip these lands of resources, forgetting about the fact that we have lived through and our ancestors have lived through centuries of our own lands being stripped of our resources. And I thought it was really important to mention in the context of the conversation we're having here today, two things that are dear to my heart that I've been campaigning on, my organisations have been campaigning on for many years, and that's the Rwanda deal. And whilst that might be a new thing, the actual Rwanda deal, the reality is what it's linked to has been going on for decades and decades. So it's directly linked to the Windrush scandal. It's directly linked to the mass deportations by charter flight. And Global Justice Now, my organisation, BARAC UK, are part of a coalition of organisations that are campaigning against detentions and deportations and against the Rwanda deal. So the very fact that the UK could strike up a deal with a country on the African continent to take people, really imprison people and force them into a country actually that may be on a continent that they have fled and gone on perilous journeys to get to the UK, and actually demonise and label those people and operate a system of apartheid in saying, because you came on small boats, then we're immediately going to detain you and deport you to Rwanda. And if anybody's under any illusion that people are going to be processed there and then end up in the UK, no, they're going to be dumped there. Whilst we look at the situation in Ukraine, which has been horrendous for those people who are displaced, look at the different reception that they've received. And what's the difference between those people and people that are being targeted for deportation to Rwanda? And it's that they're people from the global south who are black and brown who didn't have safe passage. We're not afforded safe passage in the same way as people who are displaced in the West are afforded. And that's the difference. And what does that equal? It equals racism. At the heart of all of this, at the core of all of this, is racism. And when we talk about reparations and compensation, and as I said at the beginning, compensation and reparations takes many forms. and actually it's about healing. It's about peace. It's not just about finances. If we look at the Windrush compensation scheme, lots of people think the Windrush scandal is over. It's not. It was one, the children and grandchildren of the Windrush generation are being targeted for deportation, and the vast majority of people who were impacted by the Windrush scandal are still impacted by it. They still haven't got compensation. Many of them have died because of the age that they've reached, and they've died in poverty, in pain, in trauma, having lost everything, when that compensation could have actually given them some peace of mind and some standard of living in their final years of life. And in the last year, of all those people that appealed against the compensation levels that was awarded because it was woefully low and inadequate, only 1% have received compensation. So I just wanted to just highlight those figures because they are directly linked to everything that we have just been speaking about so far today. So I'm going to open it up. We've got a roving mic, and I'm going to take batches of questions and come back to the panel. So if you can raise your hand if you've got a contribution or question, and if it is a question and it's for a specific panel member, please say which one. Okay, so I've got one. I'll take two more. 2, 3, 4. Yeah? Oh, is that an elbow up?
Yeah.
Your hand up? Just do your hair. Sorry. I'll take those 3 then.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering, I guess particularly for Sadie, whether you see a danger in the kind of reparations which would be from governments in the global north to those in the global south, in compensation payments coming with the kinds of conditions, of neoliberal conditions that loans from the IMF and the World Bank have come with historically. And yeah, I was just wondering about your view on that.
Hi, thank you all for bringing your stories and your knowledge here today. It was really, really interesting. Mine's directed at Sadie, but it can take around any member of the panel. How do we really communicate about complex notions of climate reparations, colonialism, loss and damage to the average Joe on the street who wouldn't usually find themselves at a TWT festival, especially sort of in a right-wing media atmosphere, as we need to build a broad coalition behind in the global north to get these governments to hand out what they owe, especially when you hear stuff about, well, look at aid and how they say, oh, you're taking away from schools here if you're giving aid, and how that would be heightened probably in the cost of living crisis as well.
Thank you all. Really good speeches from everybody. I just actually wanted to ask everybody's perspective on the debt justice campaign and how that might play into questions of reparations and climate justice as well, and if you had any thoughts on that.
All right, mine did link a little bit to some of the points that's already been made. There's one question I wanted to ask. If countries pull back from these agreements, can they actually be sued for pulling out of those agreements? Because it seems to me that there's a cycle here of attack, attack, attack. You know, like when does that end? And on another thing, it's just basically we need to get like the education decolonised so people actually understand this thing, and until we do that, it's going to be a hard thing to do. But the other thing links to the tax justice thing is, I mean, has it actually been looked at? Because what we do know, these transnational companies, they're very keen on suing for money. They're not very keen on paying the taxes. But if we think about, not only are they not paying their taxes, they're actually costing countries a lot of money. If, for instance, they do with aeroplanes and stuff like that, they're actually actively polluting our environment on a daily basis, which costs us in innumerable ways what we have to do to counteract that, and they're already not paying into. Has anybody ever added up how much these transnationals are actually costing us per country to clear up the mess? Because it's all very well, we planted 100 trees and that, blah, blah, blah. But, that doesn't impact the schools that are near the airports. All of that, and all of that comes from the cars, everything the damage they do, but we even know how much that added to that's in it.
Thanks, Tracy. Okay, so I'm going to come back to the panel in reverse order then, start with Sadie, and I know there was a specific question for you as well. So.
Can I get a microphone?
Theatre.
Thanks. So on the question on the neoliberal conditions, I mean, right, because you can give finance, but then if it ends up just putting countries further into debt or just reaching communities in a way that harms them more than it helps them, that's no good. I think this is kind of another demand that must come from the movements, basically to say that we want finance to go to communities, we want it to go to the people most affected, because often even climate finance, when it does get sent to the global south, often it's not used to help the people who are most affected anyway. I guess I would just say that we need to demand that it reaches local communities, that it helps them in a way that is determined by them as well, rather than trying to come and impose our idea of what we think is best for them, because we don't know. That's all I would say.
There were some kind of quite big questions in there. I'll start with just the specific small answerable one about can you be sued for pulling out of it? You can't exactly be sued, but in some cases there is what's called a sunset clause within the agreements that mean that if you leave, then you can still be sued for a certain number of years afterwards. So the case with the Keystone pipeline is being brought under the NAFTA trade agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico, which has actually been replaced. It's been replaced by an agreement that doesn't have so much ISDS in it, partly because of the experience of being sued. But it has a 3-year sunset clause, and the owners of the Keystone pipeline snuck in the 3-year sunset clause. 3 years is a more normal level, whereas the Energy Charter Treaty has a sunset clause of 20 years, which is one of the reasons that we've been campaigning on this as part of a Europe-wide campaign in conjunction with allies all across Europe, because if we could get a mass of countries to all live together and all agree to sign an agreement between each other not to use the sunset clause, not to sue on the way out. Well, some academics have sort of assessed where are the main investments that need to be closed down. We could probably nullify the sunset clause. It is, in other situations it is possible. South Africa signed quite a few of these agreements at the end of apartheid, had bad experiences, but then they all reached a kind of review date, and they just decided to cancel the thing. They were like, no review, we're cancelling them all. They were told Armageddon would happen if they cancelled all these. No, it did not happen. So, yes, it is possible to cancel. Sometimes it's a bit tricky. In terms of we talk about these things sometimes in false isolation and silos. So I'm talking about a particular thing in trade policy, and of course there are wider things in trade policy. And then there's debt and there's tax, and I would throw in things like intellectual property protection. Really we need a comprehensive, overall, progressive approach to an international, globalized way of making the world better, and we need to find ways to do that. But actually, I find that reparations is quite a useful way of doing some of that, because I think all of those things, debt cancellation should be part of reparations, technology transfer, for instance, in the transfer of the kinds of technologies that are going to be needed to cope with the climate crisis, should be part of reparations. Whereas at the minute, trade rules are likely to say that these countries that have been at the tough end of the climate crisis are then going to be told that in order to transition, they're going to have to pay expensive royalties to the patents to that technology to actually be able to adapt. Well, no, that shouldn't happen. We should change the trade rules. We should make it part of reparations. Tax, yeah, definitely. We should have. We talk about windfall tax. We should definitely have a windfall tax on the fossil fuel companies, but we shouldn't just have a windfall tax. We should have an ongoing, meaningful taxation on corporations like this. Yes, we need the big picture. Sometimes, I suppose, then going back to the question about communicating, I'm never quite sure. Is it better to communicate the massive picture, except sometimes that overwhelms people, or do you communicate the smaller? I don't know what the answer is to that. But when you're talking about how do you communicate these things, I try and communicate a thing called the investor-state dispute settlement to people. It's always a challenge. I don't think there are any easy answers.
Thank you. I'll come in on that question about, how do you explain it? And I agree, it's not necessarily that easy, depends who you're speaking to. But my experience through my life has been that telling personal stories is the thing that connects with human beings. Human beings connect with human stories. And I think if you start to break it down, and you start to put a family or an individual or somebody in your community or your workplace into that context, people engage with it in a more meaningful and deeper way, and that's probably the avenue then that can open it up for you to have that wider conversation. As well as being a human rights and community activist, I'm also a trade unionist in 2 unions. And so often when we're having meetings of members, whilst we have a lot of focus on what's happening in our workplaces and the things that people are really concerned about, their pay and terms and conditions, actually a lot of those things have a connection. When we're talking about tax justice, for example, and we're talking about race equality in the workplace, having speakers that come in and can talk about those things and put those things into context and link it to what's happening to us with the cost of living crisis, for example. When we have equality for one group of people, everything is better for everybody. And I think sometimes we have to remind people of that. And a few years back, we were involved in the I Am an Immigrant campaign. So we had an organisation that BARAC with other organisations co-founded, Movement Against Xenophobia, to campaign against the Immigration Act that was going through at the time, which actually led to the Windrush scandal or the hostile environment we see now. But whilst we were running that campaign, we did this billboard campaign that was on buses and trains and billboards. I am an immigrant, and it was real people saying, I'm an immigrant, I'm a nurse, I'm a builder, I'm a carpenter, I'm a doctor, I'm a barrister, I'm a civil servant, whatever it was, and I came to this country from XX country, and this is the job I do, and this is how I've contributed to British society. So I think that making those links and reminding people, actually, the UK is a country made up of migrant populations over centuries, not just decades or recent years. Those are the sorts of things that people connect to, and where we get the opening then to have a broader conversation. Yusuf, did you want to come in on any of the questions so far?
I just wanted to repeat the question if I'm not wrong. I want to say about I think you're talking about how we can communicate colonialism, debt justice, and climate justice. What is the question? Okay, so I belong to colonized lands we were like formally colonized by Britain. So talking about colonialism, like the places which were colonized before and the exploitation is happening right now, and exploitation happening in our land just because of the colonization. And the colonizers who have formerly colonized our lands are taking our resources to their own lands, and we are not getting enough resources to support our own self, and people are not getting benefits from those resources. Instead of this, people are suffering from the effects of the climate crisis. We were formerly colonized, but still there are exploitation projects going on. So talking about this in a broader picture, I feel like everything is connected. Just because of the colonialism exploitations are happening, and just because of the exploitations we are suffering from the effects of the climate crisis.
Rounds of contributions, and I'm going to look to this side of the room because a lot of people came from that side first time round. So I've got 1, 2, 3 more, 3. Okay, I'm going to take those 3. Thank you.
Hi, can I just say thank you to all the people who contributed, Yusuf in particular to you, because the lived experience, the shared experience is so important because it humanises people. And I know that you said you live here, but I'm sure you must be affected by knowing what's going on in your family back home. And I've seen the footage of people waist deep in water. I think what's interesting in the global north is that people think, oh, that's over there. Well, it's not as over there as they would think, because we've had water shortages this summer with the heat, and the reservoirs dried up, and some people in some areas of the country were having to have bottled water. And I'm sure if we don't reverse all of this, there will come a time when the only job that everybody has is looking for water, because it's the one thing we can't live without. Every human being on this planet needs water. The huge corporations have stolen all the clean water around the world in the global south, and they force people to become nomadic, and they have to move and keep travelling to find clean water. It's absolutely disgusting. I always speak about it as the rape of the planet. That's what's happened by white middle class men in their entitlement, but they're so stupid they forget that their own children are breathing all this polluted air as well. I think if people interrogate their conscience, that's all they need to do. Because, you know, it's okay to look and say, oh, isn't that really sad what's happening, and people are drowning and babies are starving to death. It's coming here. Pollution doesn't have borders. It doesn't recognise borders. We've seen with the climate change, we used to have flooding maybe every 10, 20, 30 years. And our government's mantra is once in every 100 years. We have flooding every year now, and sometimes people are flooded out 4 times in a year, and they're seeing it. And it's sad to watch. They need to look at what people in your country are going through, because that is a drop in the ocean, although it's quite painful. They lose their furniture, their homes, they dry them out, and then the floods come again. But I just think, and I'm going to say this, the global north, in its arrogance, its entitlement, think it has the right. I view all of the minerals and everything and all of the land on this planet as belonging to everybody. And we've got a small group of people who've hijacked it, who've stolen it. Nobody owns any land as such. But as you say, the people in the global north have stolen it, they've colonised, they've done everything. It's global murder, it's social murder, and we need to call it that, because if you lighten the language, people say, oh, it's not as bad. Yesterday I was at an event here, and they were talking about our government selling arms. I've got 2 arms hanging from my shoulder. They're exporting murder, they're selling murder to kill children in the global south, and that's the language we have to use, because everything's clinicalised, collateral damage. And when I heard you talking, because we campaigned against TTIP for years, Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, ISDS, Investor State Settlement, where they've bankrupted countries. I didn't know that was still there. I thought we'd been successful. So that's quite painful to hear that. But we have to fight, we have to challenge it. And it's interesting because when you speak to people in the global north and you say, do you want to tackle climate change? Do you want a greener planet? And it's for the next generation. They all want to, but nobody wants to change anything, and that's the reality, so let's call it what it is. But thank you so much.
Yes, thank you to all the speakers. It's like such an important topics that we're discussing there. And the environmental racism is something we really need to speak out against. I mean, we've talked about, the effect of climate change and the inequalities, but also when we think about the subsidies our government are giving to those oil companies that then, totally pollute lands and communities across the world, in the global south, or even like dumping waste in global south countries. So there's like so many different aspects. I mean, we've talked about reparation being beyond financial compensations. And I think somebody mentioned like debt as well, because it's not just like those courts and the exploitation through colonization, it's also the huge debts that have been put on global south countries in recent decades by the Global World Bank and the IMF. And those debts will never be repaid. It's absolutely horrendous. But yeah, I just wanted to ask the speaker, beyond like financial compensation, what are the other actions that we can take? I'm trying to like think more concretely, as activists in the global north, what we can do. I'm thinking about amplifying the voices of comrades in the global south, maybe linking up with diaspora communities who live, here, and also doing like some training with lots of the climate justice group, because I think we've got more work to do on ourselves on decolonization. But yeah, any other thoughts that we can like do concretely to go beyond this financial ones?
Yeah, it's just a small thought about the courts, and just because it does seem like they've decided like they own it, and then they've set it all up. And I was just thinking, most people haven't got a clue about those courts, and although you managed, you and other people managed to get them out of the Australian trade deal, which is fantastic. But I was just thinking, maybe you could set up a very big court that's very public, that tries them for everything they've done, and just have an ongoing sort of story going on, so people can learn about it. And I'm sure it would collapse if everyone actually started to know the truth more and more, because it's totally unacceptable.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. I think I feel like I should answer your question because I belong to global south and I've been living here for like almost entire of my life. I'm living here just for like 10 months. So the most important thing is amplifying the voices from the front lines, the people who have been actually affected by the climate crisis. And it's not only the climate crisis, it could be any crisis, and we need to connect those crises together and to amplify the voices. But the most important thing right now in Fridays for Future too, we're trying to put people accountable, people in power accountable, and push them towards laws and damages to finance them. Because in last COP26, we tried to campaign about that, just because in global south it's so important. Like I was talking about the recent flood, 33 million people were displaced and they have nowhere to go, and they don't have resources to build their houses and to rehabilitate themselves, and then the government has resources to rehabilitate the people who have been impacted by the flood. So the most important thing is to highlight their voices, and the other thing is to keep pushing your governments accountable and keep pressuring them to take immediate action, and keep pressuring the fossil fuels companies to, to ban fossil fuels and breaking and stuff. So yeah.
I mean, I like the idea of putting the corporations and the idea of these secret tribunals on trial. Yes, and yeah, I'm really sorry that TTIP. I mean, it was a good victory because if we'd had this in a trade deal with the US, that would have. At the minute, we don't have this with US corporations, and of it, the US corporations are some of the ones that sue the most. It was a victory, but unfortunately, it wasn't a complete victory. But in terms of what you said, most people don't know about ISDS, about corporate courts. Every normal person, when you tell them, they think it's outrageous. You know, there are a few people who are completely bought into the system who just think, well, yeah, that's just how the system works. But you know, most people think, no, yeah, we need to get rid of this. And I think of it sometimes as a vampire theory of change. If you just pull it out into the light, it can't survive. And so that also goes to what more can we do? I mean, I think the things that you said yourself, more raising voices, as Yusuf has also said, but also just talking to, getting these ideas, not just so for corporate courts, there's that sort of like just the more people who know about them, the harder it is to defend. But also just in the wider picture, the more people who are used to thinking in terms of the fact that the North owes reparations. That's the way that we should be framing things, not because, I mean, part, I suppose, of the communication is to, you know, so often around the time of COP, there's too much success in pushing this story that it's all the fault of China or India. No, that's not the frame that we're, so everything that we can do just in talking about this, or you know, writing or just sharing things to help put across the frame that sees it from completely the other way around, and make that the norm and that the way that people approach things is one very sort of fundamental thing.
On the question about other actions we can take beyond compensation, a lot of what I talked about in my speech there was about kind of, so in the Climate Reparations Network we have this series of stop and start demands. So they're like, stop doing all these things that we're actively doing to harm communities, and then start doing the things that repair communities. So I was talking more about the things we can start doing, you know, providing compensation, providing a transformative program for, you know, all kinds of social services, safe housing, etc. But there's also, I didn't talk much about the stop the harm part, and I think it's really important to connect climate reparations to the active harm that fossil fuel companies are doing, and that's what we're starting to do with calls for taxation on fossil fuel companies. Equally, there's people campaigning now for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which is kind of based off of the treaty around nuclear arms, nuclear murder weapons, non-proliferation treaty, so calling for just the total cessation of the use of fossil fuels. The other thing I would say is we need to connect, as Zita was saying, climate reparations to migrant justice, because how can we help repair the harm if we're turning away climate migrants and other migrants at the borders. So yeah, that's what I'd say. The other thing I forgot to respond to this question about comms. The one thing I would add to the good answers about personal stories is I think the general public agrees that corporations have screwed us over and that big polluters should be responsible for what they've done. So kind of rather than framing it that the general taxpayer is going to have to, you know, pay for climate reparations, well, I think to some extent we may. The big polluters paying first and most for the damage they've done, and say the colonial empires paying most for what they've done, is an angle that I think does resonate with the general.
I'll just add something on your question, Clara. So I work on the basis of there should be nothing about us without us. So we need to have a seat at the table and a voice. And we shouldn't be an optional add-on or, you know, a last thought. Actually, our voices need to be there. Those who are directly impacted need to be there and centre to the movement. And that might mean that sometimes some other people need to step aside, yeah, and not take up space to allow us to take up space. If we don't have equality within the movement that's supposed to be addressing these issues, how are we even going to achieve anything if we don't understand how equality works or inequality and discrimination works? I think that we need to do more here in the West with engaging with the global South and listening and talking to and connecting with. So for example, in November, I'm part of a group that organised an annual conference, Bandung Conference, and this year, it's an annual conference that connects the African continent with the African diaspora globally. And it's quite important because, you know, our struggles against racism are interconnected, and that applies to other regions as well. But this year, our conference is focused on the environment and climate. So I'll be there and I'll be speaking a session at the conference. But actually, the conference, whilst it's focused on our diaspora, we welcome everybody to come to that conference. So we'd welcome, you know, climate campaigners to come along to the conference and engage and connect with people in the diaspora and on the continent who are at the forefront of having to fight for the environment and dealing with the legacies of colonialism at the same time on the continent. And I think that if we have platforms, people can use their platforms, you know, to amplify the voices of those who are not able to, but more importantly is to actually give a space for those voices to be heard directly. If you have journals, for example, you can invite those directly impacted to come and write articles, to guest edit, you know, to take over your own spaces, not just invite it to be on the platform, but invite us to come in and be directly involved. I think that that's really important because actually those who are on the receiving end of discrimination are the ones that have to lead the struggles against it. So therefore we can't be leading from the back with other people speaking on our behalf. We should be up the front and you should be supporting us and giving solidarity. So I think that's the way to think about it and look at it. So we've got time for another round. Our speakers have been so disciplined with their time that we've actually got time. Normally with these things, we're running out of time for another round of questions and contributions before we wrap up. So if you can raise your hand if you'd like to come in. So I've got one there. Anybody else? I'm hoping it'll be the final round. So you raised your hand there, yeah? I'm sorry. See you. That's two. Could take two more. Anybody else?
Final chance.
Oh, two more there.
There we are.
Three. So that's it. Yeah, those five. We'll take those five. Thank you.
Hiya. It's more of a comment, but please add if you feel like it, about what we can do beyond economic compensation. This particular discourse applies much more to the New World, but still we should support it. I think we need to talk more about land back and how Indigenous people are generally the rightful stewards of the land and they know how best to lead in environmental regeneration. But not only that, it will also help undo the damages of settler colonialism, both cultural and economic, wherever that may apply.
I'm not quick shot to phrase this question. Just wondering if the panel could maybe comment about ecocide law and if that would help with any of these Dublin treaties and reparations.
Thanks. I was just wondering about what you're saying, like with Western countries now seeing it as in their interest to pull out of things like the Energy Charter Treaty, and whether we're limited to only when they see it as being in their interest, and are we able to force them to do things that actually aren't in their interest or they don't see as in their interest?
I was just wondering if the panel could expand on arguments against the idea that China and India are somehow responsible for the polluting events that are going on now, and asking to what extent they view that developing countries should be allowed somehow to access polluting resources that they have historically been taken away from them. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Yeah, if you think.
I just wondered, and in terms of reparation, you're going to have to kind of make the link yourself, because I can't. The CEO of Nestle has said that water is not a human right. And I was wondering what the panel's view on that is, and also in terms of water is a political tool now. I mean, if you think about Palestine and the way water courses, they've taken them away from Palestinian land. And actually, I have a belief that, forget about oil, water is going to be the one that causes major problems. Thank you.
Hi, thanks again for being so informative. One of my focuses is Palestine, so thanks for bringing it up. Israel is brilliant at greenwashing, as many of the big corps are and colonial powers are. Israel's ultimate aim is to colonize all of Palestine, but they are currently degrading the land which they want to take over. So how do we target greenwashing campaigns?
Okay, so I'll go this way.
If I forget to answer that question, that's fine. I'm not going to address all of them, although they're all really amazing points and questions. On ecocide law, there are some active approaches to trying to bring some kind of liability for climate damages into international systems of law. I'm not sure if it's particularly called, they're using the word ecocide, but the government of Vanuatu is currently seeking an advisory opinion from I think it's the International Court of Justice to, I don't know the exact words, make ecocide a crime. But unfortunately, the International Court of Justice is kind of a non-binding, human rights-y kind of tribunal that can have symbolic precedent, but doesn't have any legal sense of bindingness at a national level. There have also been attempts in national courts to establish liability. There's a Peruvian farmer who's suing, I think, a German oil company for the climate damages that are facing his community after the local glaciers melting and causing flooding. So that's kind of in progress to see whether they're going to establish any kind of liability for like a specific company to cause climate damages. There's also cases around people trying to establish the legal right to be a climate refugee, which is not a recognized category of migration. Climate change is not legally recognized as an acceptable reason for someone who would be accepted as an asylum claimant. So it could help. I'm skeptical that it's going to be the thing that brings climate reparations in full, because the legal case, the bindingness of international tribunals are not strong enough. On the arguments about China and India, obviously they've got the big populations and so emissions are rising. But one thing I want to point out about China is that a lot of emissions in China are actually coming from manufacturing that the West has sent over there, because like emissions started rising in China like a lot after basically we started moving factories there, and so even if that's captured in, so first of all, they have lower per capita emissions. Yeah, they have more people, but each person is consuming a lot less than someone in Europe or North America. Even within the emissions per capita, that counts the industrial emissions that are happening due to like people going to work in a factory to make our stupid shit that we buy on Amazon. Also, when people talk about India, I mean, if you just think about what like the colonial pillaging of India by the UK, I mean, I can't remember the dollar figure, but it was, trillions of dollars in basically wealth that was extracted from India. So many people died during famine that was created by the British colonial government. So those are two arguments I would use to fight back against that.
Can we actually get rid of ISDS not just when Western countries think it's in their interest? Maybe I overemphasize it. It's partly because when sort of saying, look, some of the Western countries are thinking of doing this, I wouldn't necessarily trust that myself if you were trying to tell me, oh, they've just sort of suddenly seen the light. Partly I can trust that, some of them, particularly the ones that, like, the Netherlands have been sued, as I said. Suddenly they're against this system. Germany has been sued. It has quite a lot of doubt. Spain has been sued a lot. It's definitely leaving. I can trust that these countries probably are going to do that because I can see that they have their own selfish reasons for doing it. Actually, much of the drive for scrapping ISDS has come very much from countries in the global south. I mentioned South Africa dropping their treaties. Brazil has always refused to sign any. India has also scrapped their treaties. Ecuador and Bolivia both got rid of their treaties under previous governments, and then have wavered a bit, but with the sort of maybe a renewed left in South America. There may be more there. Tanzania has also been taking action, and then you have countries like New Zealand and also the US and Canada themselves, again because they've been sued. Forcing them to, yes, I believe it can be done. In terms of that it is something that is very hard to defend. Okay, maybe the current government seems completely. Anyway, right, the less said the better. Keep to the home. I worked with communities in Armenia who were resisting a case and around a gold mine. They did not want the gold mine to go ahead, and they had blockaded the gold mine and refused to let people. And so the company was threatening a case, and they just continued. They're like, no, we're just going to keep blockading, and we're going to keep protesting, and we're going to protest in the capital, and we're going to blockade at the bone mine, and eventually the company went bust. It's possible. Look on the strong side.
I wanted to answer the India and China questions, but I think Sadie almost covered everything. So I think, so we should count the emissions per capita. When counting the emissions per capita in India and China, it's much lower than most of the global north countries. And also, we need to consider back just because I belong to a place where there are lots of Chinese projects going on, and because of those Chinese projects, lots of people are being displaced. So I think this is just an issue. Like we need to acknowledge this that there is operation within operation. Like the people in China are suffering from the impacts of the climate crisis, but still the Chinese government is still like trying to oppress other people in other countries. So operation exists within global south. So when we're talking about like all those things, so I think in India, like mostly like half of the population is suffering from like extreme poverty. Like people are living below the poverty line. So I don't think it would be wise to ask India to lower their emissions because they won't be having anything to eat. So like the concept of financing loss and damages comes from here. Like the global north countries have the responsibility to support those communities, especially in like talking about India and China or any other countries where like we can say they're high polluters, but still we need to support them to lower their emissions. If we support them, they will be able to lower their emissions. If we don't support them, then how they can like produce their like 2 tons of food for their people. So yeah.
Thank you. I think like the panel have like responded to all that last round of questions, and I just wanted to add one quick thing. There were a couple of points that came up about Palestine, and it made me think about a delegation I went on, the trade union delegation to Palestine a couple of years ago, particularly the village of Nabi Saleh, which is in Ramallah, and has been targeted by Israel with force, where, you know, families, mothers are telling us when we went to visit, they have to fight every weekend, be prepared to be on the front line fighting to defend their village, and have like a secret language to use to say goodbye to family members because they know that might be the last time they see them on that Saturday when they're going out to protest. But one of the things when we went round the village, they showed us is up on the hill, the stream that they rely on for water supplies into that village has been cut off and occupied as a means of trying to force them out of that village. And the family, they have been there, they're all an interconnected family that have been there for, you know, hundreds of years. And they are firmly staying rooted. And they say that it's really difficult because they're having to have conversations with themselves about, is this the fairest thing to do for their children, you know, just to survive today? But they have to look at historically and the future that they're producing for their children and stay rooted where they are despite all of these attacks. But of course, taking away water supply is you know, a way that could force people out, because what do you do if you haven't got any water coming in? So I think that it's another example of how those struggles are connected, and the solidarity we give when we're talking about occupation and Palestine goes much deeper than, you know, what people might see on the surface. This is about people actually fighting for the past, fighting for the future, fighting for the survival on a daily basis. And that solidarity actually needs to be practical, which is why we actually took an all-women's delegation to Palestine, trade union delegation. It's the first time an all-women's delegation had been, because we had a particular focus on women and gender and what was happening to women in the country in a way that hadn't been done before, because a lot of these delegations, male-dominated when these delegations happened. But practical solidarity is also a reason why 10 years ago, BARAC UK decided to do humanitarian aid and solidarity distributions to refugees in northern France, because it's all very well in everything that we campaign and all the things that we're talking about, you know, having placards at a demo, giving solidarity. But in reality, when you're fighting for your very survival on a daily basis, you need people to take action. And we have the means and the power to take action. In the West, we've got much more comfortable lives. Yes, we're going through struggles, but it's nothing compared to a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. So it's crucial that we use that privilege that we have to actually put our solidarity into something meaningful and practical. Words are great. Having a message of solidarity is fantastic. It lifts your spirits. But there's nothing better than somebody going out and doing something and standing beside you, shoulder to shoulder, on a physical basis. So we coming to an end. I'm just going to ask the panel to come back to them just for 1 minute, just to say, if you want to stay in touch with them, how can you connect? What's your social media details and contact details so that people can stay connected? And I think we've been tweeting from the Global Justice Now, isn't it, Twitter? So you can probably pick up all our connections through that as well. So yeah, I'll go down that way and just let us know any connections.
So first of all, thank you so much everyone for coming here and giving us your time. And you can always contact me on my social media, which is called Yusuf Baloch. And I'm sure do we need to repeat the spelling because most of the time
it's on the fly, it's on the communications.
And also, you can email me on yusufbaloch@gmail.com.
Thank you. I'll come back to mine after.
So, if you think we should get rid of these ISDS settlements, this flyer has a QR code linked to a petition. If you sign the petition, we'll email you. And and there's more material. I also just want to say, on the Energy Charter Treaty in particular, we've got until November to try and get all the countries to pull out. I have a feeling there's maybe going to be quite a lot of things to do in November. But on the 4th of November, we're possibly planning to be outside of Bays with somebody dressed as Jacob Rees-Mogg and a fracking rig and a big sign to get rid of. So come join us, do things in other places on the 4th of November if you can, and then on the 12th of November, go on a big march.
Can you just get the real man himself?
Well, yeah, it's bonfire night, so I can say we should put on a bonfire. Yeah, down to crack off.
Who here can believe that Jacob Rees-Mogg is actually like the energy minister? Like that guy? ClimateReparations.uk, I'm pretty sure is our website. I'm pretty sure. Otherwise, just Google Climate Reparations UK. And on this flyer, the Make Polluters Pay flyer, you can sign up to the Make Polluters Pay Coalition and catch us on November 12th in London at the Climate Justice March for the Reparations Law. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. BARAC UK. On Twitter, we're BARAC UK. On Instagram, we're BARAC UK Original. And there's a link tree on our Instagram, which will give you all the links to our petitions against deportations, our crowdfunder for humanitarian aid website, all of that stuff, all our actions and things. That's the best way to find everything else. We have got a Facebook page, Facebook group, website, again, just put BARAC, then UK into Google and things should come up. And I want to thank all our speakers today for travelling here and coming and being on this panel. Global Justice Now for organising this event and coordinating everything. To the team at World Transform for the tech staff and organisations, behind the scenes, and to, of course, to all of you for being here and giving up your time to be with us today, and for your fantastic contributions as well. Take care, hope you have a good rest of the conference, and hope to see you on the frontline battles, on those demonstrations and protests.